Skype, and it's already going on air. Okay, that's good. So with 2 recorders active, I think we may be okay. Okay, so I'll do a brief pause here and find my coffee, and we'll get started. Welcome to this edition of the High Strangeness Factor, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, Steve Ward. And with me tonight, again, this is, I think, three shows in a row, is Andy Mercer, my co-host, co-creator of the show, and producer. Well, that's a lot of stuff there. And I'm going to say jack of all trades as well, because he's the guy that when I have any technical problems, I run to Andy like a little baby. Andy, help me out. How do I figure this out? And of course, he's very, very patient and takes me through it. So, Andy, how are you doing?
I'm not too bad. It's not too bad at all. It's been an interesting day. I've been finally finalised completely my book on Dante's Inferno, which is now gone off to the publisher. We've done numerous rewrites over the last week, all kind of hurried because we want to get it out for November. But that's finally gone. So that's done. I was up till 4 o'clock in the morning this morning writing it, getting the last final changes done. But that's all sorted out now. So I'm pleased with that. So that's gone. Hopefully.
So how soon do we think that people might be able to have this in their hands to read it?
November. It's actually
wow.
The opening text that it's going to be out. It's the November publication for the series that it's part of. It's a series of monographs, which are basically shortish books on various occult-related topics from my publisher. It's been a bit of a busy time for them. They've not been able to get a lot out because of all the stuff that's been going on. We won't go into all that, obviously. But he's in California, so they've also been contend with the fires that have been going on. So they've slowed down production on the normal work and been working on these monographs. And mine is one slated for November, and it's going to be out in November. Hopefully.
And who's printing it?
A company called Three Hands Press, my main publisher in the States.
Okay. So. Oh, great. It seems like in the old days, or maybe it still is that with conventional publishing, it takes months, even a year sometimes for the book once it's done. And,
oh God, yeah. I mean, my other main book that I have written for Three Hands Press was slated for release last year, but for various reasons there's a few changes. It's now not coming out until next year. So that's a much more kind of what we say normal length book. It's much longer than this one, but that's taking a couple of years. But that, that's fine. As you say with books, once you've written it and it's out there, you can't change it. It's done. So if there's any mistakes that are in it, you're stuck with the mistakes. So you always want to ensure that everything is just as good as it can be. But even big classic texts have got errors in. I mean, I understand there's actually a typo in the American Constitution. Apparently, there's a comma in the wrong place, so I read somewhere. So, even the best documents can have errors in them. So you want to do your best to ensure there's nothing wrong. But that's this one has been quite a fast turnaround for me, from starting it back in about June to actually having it ready to go out in November. It's incredibly fast for me. Normally, it takes me years. So.
Well, with the book that I'm in the process of writing with Joey Medea, which will be out in the next decade, I wonder how this must have happened to you, or has it happened, where the book is out, but you have different ideas or something's changed that you wish you could have gotten in there, not necessarily a typo or a mistake, but something you would like to interject another idea or subtract an idea.
Oh, God, absolutely. The other book of mine that should be out towards the end of this year is my book on runes, which the original version actually wrote in the early 2000s. And it's amazing to think it was nearly 20 years ago I wrote it. But
wow.
There's that didn't actually get published until about 5 years ago. We could do a whole show on the curse of that book, things that went wrong. But even in that time, I have wanted to change it. Now, the second edition is coming out, say, hopefully later this year, is substantially different to the original. I mean, the basic structure is the same, but I've rewritten whole chunks of it. And so that's quite a considerable amount of change I've made to that one. So, it's nice to have the opportunity to do second editions of your books. In fact, my very first book that came out, again, about 5 years ago, written long before, I've secured a deal for the second edition of that book with my current publisher, which is my next working project to get the revisions done for that. There'll be less change in that one because I'm quite happy with it as it was, but there's, again, new information I want to add to it. But certainly my rune book, there's quite a few changes that have been made that things that just made sense at the time, but I look back now and think, actually, no, I've got a better way of doing that. So, yeah, a lot of change in those two as well. So, but yeah,
Well,
it's good to get the
it's not
chance to reflect
surprising.
it.
I mean, we're always reading, we're always learning, and we always, unless we're uh, human beings, their thinking isn't static. We're not
Yeah.
just stuck. So that's like I'm going to mention him right now, John Keel, who we'll be talking a lot about. No
Hmm.
surprise.
Really?
His yes, I know this is for those that do the John Keel drinking game on the High Strangeness Factor, you get your first swig already. We're going to get you drunk in a short period of time, like the last episode. But his thinking wasn't static either. And if you go through the articles he wrote over the decades, you'll find that he was presenting different ideas and different thoughts. And you could tell that he had either changed his thinking or was just pursuing different ideas and putting them out there. But with no further ado, let's introduce our guest. Bill Kousoulas has had a lifelong interest in the paranormal, which began in the late 1970s with the original. It was called UFO. What was it called? Uh, Help me out here, Bill. The original
Project
title,
UFO.
Project UFO, right, which was about two guys from Project Blue Book series that aired on Sunday night television. And I remember that actually when in real time. I'm so old that I actually watched some of those episodes. In 2003, he was introduced to the Mothman Prophecies film, and it truly changed his life. Since then, he has read nearly all of John Keel's research, as well as the works of similar authors, including Gray Barker, Andrew Colvin, and Brent Raines. Since 2016, Bill and his wife Jackie has visited Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which of course is the focal point for the Mothman sightings and other high strangeness, on a regular basis. And they have become friends with several area residents, including the late Carolyn Harris, who was the co-founder of the Mothman Festival and a truly great lady. Presently, Bill is completing his PhD in psychology with a focus on post-traumatic growth. Bill and Jackie are also in the preliminary stages of a phenomenological study that will examine the correlations between paranormal experiences and post-traumatic growth. They presently reside in northern Illinois. Bill, welcome to the High Strangeness Factor.
Steve, thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'm really glad you're here, and let's. And of course, you met Andy already off air, and I'm going to tell Andy how we got together here. I went down last weekend to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which is about my third time in the past month, and this past weekend. Seth Breedlove, who is the head of Small Town Monsters, was there. He was promoting his various DVDs in front of the Mothman Museum, and including his most recent one, which is called The Mothman Legacy, which I talked about briefly last time. I actually have a speaking role in it. You see me pop up once in a while as a talking head, and trying to sound like I know what I'm talking about. And anyway, it's very, very well produced, but he was out there with all those, and I happened to meet Bill, his wife Jackie, and their friend Amanda, who I guess you guys met Amanda at a Illinois MUFON meeting or a symposium.
Yes, we did.
And Bill recognized me. So, I don't know if that means I'm almost marginally famous or not, but from Facebook anyway. So we had a great time. I mean, you guys were kind of on your way. How many days had you been down in Point Pleasant?
Well, we arrived in Point Pleasant late Sunday, and the goal was to stick around Sunday through Friday and then leave Friday. But after dinner with Jeff Wamsley on Monday, he had told us that Seth and his crew were doing a kickoff of the Mothman Legacy on Saturday, and he encouraged us to stick around. In fact, he was going to introduce us to Seth, and we were going to have a conversation with him, but unfortunately, Jeff's wife's relative passed away, and they had to go to the funeral that day. So Jeff couldn't be there, but we walked in, Steve, and I saw you, and lo and behold, we just connected and had a great time talking, probably for about an hour or so.
That's right, and I'm glad we met up because it. I knew it was one of these things. It was the last minute. What was it? Friday, I guess. Friday afternoon, I was trying to decide, do I want to go down to Point Pleasant again for the third time? And of course, the answer was yes. So I drove down, and I knew that it was going to be fun talking to Seth again. And of course, Jeff Walmsley is the curator of the Mothman Museum and the co-founder of the Mothman Festival. And I always like to harass Jeremy, who's the guy behind the counter that is very busy these days selling Mothman T-shirts and so forth. But I have to say, you guys really made the trip. I mean, it was just, as you know, when as you and Andy know, when we get to go to these events, whether it's just a kind of a minor event where with the small town monsters and not a full-fledged convention, or if it is a full-fledged conference, it's just an absolute blast to meet people that of like mind, and you can talk about this kind of stuff without people looking at you like you're a little bit strange. But yeah. So yeah, it was just a great time. So I guess what I usually will start with is what footsteps, what happened in your life to bring you where you are now. I mean, with the intense focus on the paranormal in general. Of course, we're all students of John Keel, and but everybody has kind of a pathway. And one of the things you mentioned, one of the it was it's sort of science fiction and fantasy literature, which seems to kind of play into this a little bit.
I would say that it does, Steve. It definitely does. And thanks for the great intro, gentlemen. Thanks for having me on the show. I just love to have an opportunity like Steve, you just mentioned, where you get a chance to bounce into people who don't think you're crazy when you start talking about the Mothman, because frankly, most of the population still holds me at bay a little bit when I cut loose just a bit too much. But for me, my mom and dad were divorced when I was a little guy. I was 6, my brother was 2, and we were raised by my mom and my great-grandmother. And it was on a pretty frugal budget. Mom worked what I'm guessing is probably a minimum wage job or maybe a little better. And it was tough making ends meet. But, some of our entertainment back in the 70s when we were kids was she would read to us at bedtime. She would read to us from the first fantasy author that I was ever acquainted with was the classic J.R.R. Tolkien. And she would read to us The Hobbit. And later on, that got me inspired to go out and read the rest of Tolkien's works. And I've always been kind of a completist. When I get into something, I don't do it halfway. I usually dive in head first. So from the time I was probably 9 years old, maybe even a little younger, I got interested in fantasy and things that, we couldn't really perceive with our senses, but what we could experience through our imaginations as children, and then kind of pursue through literature. And I was introduced to Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game when I was probably 12 or 13 years old, which was a fantastic creative outlet for some of this imagination that I had. And I just had a whole lot of fun with that. And years getting really into heavy metal music and being influenced by Ronnie James Dio and some of these lyricists that came up with dragons and fantasy and imagery I was familiar with. And to back up just a little bit, Steve and I had talked. I had been exposed to Project UFO, the 1970s television show, when I was probably 8 or 9 years old too. So that got me into aliens. I didn't have any idea what aliens were, just like I didn't really know what fantasy was, but I was so attracted to that from a very young age.
But how old were you when you discovered Project UFO?
I was probably 9 years old.
Okay, and you hadn't known much about aliens. Oh heck, I was into aliens. Of course, had a steady diet of science fiction films at the local theater when I was a kid. So I pretty knew what aliens were supposed to look like, I guess, according to Hollywood. But so that sort of set the groundwork. Now, Andy, are you familiar with the old TV show Project UFO? It was
very much so. Yes.
Oh, okay. Oh, good. All right. I didn't know if it was transplanted across the Atlantic or not.
It's one of those sort of programs often shown on like a Sunday afternoon over here. But yes, I remember sitting down watching it, thinking this is interesting. Yeah, no, I definitely remember it.
It was a Jack Webb production. And for those who don't know, Jack Webb was Friday. What was his first? Joe Friday, the detective. What was it? Just the facts, ma'am. And I don't know if you guys were you guys inflicted with Dragnet as well?
A little
Oh
bit.
yeah,
Okay. All right, so everybody knows what we're talking about, but it was a
yeah.
Jack Webb production, and I remember watching some of it and thinking, oh, these special effects aren't too bad. But more recently, I've got a hold of a bootleg, and please don't be angry about me getting a bootleg because it's not available on a regular DVD set. If it ever happens to become available, I will purchase it. But it is kind of fun to watch. They shoestring budget, and they did attempt to recreate some of the classic cases, or at least where they were inspired by some of the classic cases. Not terribly well, but you take you understand the level of special effects back in the 70s, and CGI didn't exist, and large budgets didn't exist either. But so that's interesting. So that really caught your attention then, that particular TV show.
It did, Steve. I remember racing home and begging my mom to watch TV on Sunday nights because that's when it was on,
Right.
and just being riveted to the TV screen, and then not knowing what to think, but just knowing that I loved it. So, I mean, that really kind of set the stage for how things have developed over the last few decades in terms of how I've kind of developed my interest in paranormal subjects.
Did you did you hit the library and gravitate to certain books or authors back then, or did that come later?
So it took me a little while to get to that point to where I was really doing a lot of reading on my own. I would say probably by 13, 14, 15, I started getting into, I mean, the entire Tolkien library, including the Silmarillion, which was so far over my head, I can't even tell you what it's about now.
Right.
But I read that, and then I got into the Dune books by Frank Herbert. I absolutely loved those. Michael Moorcock is another author that really kind of whet my appetite and showed me about the Black Blade and Elric of Melniboné and the souls he could take with that sword. That was always fascinating to me too. And then I'd say probably towards the end of my teen years, I started to segue really a little bit away from science fiction and fantasy and more into psychological horror.
So Stephen King.
A lot of Stephen King. I really went to town with his books. Salem's Lot. I loved the Dark Tower series, which of course was a little later in my life than the teens were, but I thought that was fantastically written. I really enjoyed that. Clive Barker, a little bit of his work was some more of the stuff that I was into at that point as well.
Oh yes. Did he write? Was it Never When or Neverwhere? Is that him?
I'm not familiar with that. I'd read a book by him called The Damnation Game, which was really pretty fascinating. And I think that was after I had watched the Hellraiser movies, at least the first 2 or 3 of them, because I just found those to be really fascinating as well. And then going into reading his literature, it was different, of course, than the movie was, but we get that all the time. Cinema never quite equates to writing, does it?
No. Andy, did you ever read Michael Moorcock?
Not really my cup of tea. I tended to read more horror like Clive Barker, and James Herbert was very big over here as well. Just a fun fact for you guys, might be interested to know. You mentioned Clive Barker and Hellraiser. My wife used to work with the daughter of the guy who played Pinhead.
Really?
That's pretty cool.
He didn't like to talk about it. But yeah, I mean, again, I would agree with Bill there, particularly the Hellraiser stuff. That kind of the dark dimension stuff really appealed to me as well, because it's not quite just pure horror and it's not quite sci-fi. It's kind of strange in between the two, isn't it? It's a kind of another world. And I think you're thinking of Neil Gaiman there with Netherworld. I think
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Which was a pretty good story. Kind of it's kind of a very strange. Wasn't exactly another dimension, but there was this duality there where people that get absorbed in this other realm are just kind of start to fade away from everybody, and they can't really see them anymore. It was really a very creative novel. Let's see. But I noticed from I was talking earlier that the thing that I guess really sort of hit you between the eyes was when you saw the film The Mothman Prophecies.
It was. And Steve, for me, it was almost a revitalization of some not necessarily lost interest in the paranormal, but just getting busy with career and family and child raising and things of that nature that kind of took center stage. So when I saw the movie The Mothman Prophecies with Richard Gere, it was kind of on a lark. And at that time, it's before Jackie and I had met. I was still involved with my first wife, and she had found the movie and said, "Do you want to watch this?" And I thought, well, at least we won't be arguing. So yeah, let's sit down and watch the movie.
So you saw it on the DVD then?
I did.
Okay.
Yeah. And in fact, she had rented it from like Blockbuster or something like that, which is totally defunct now, as far as I understand. We can download things at liberty now and watch YouTube
Right.
and such. But I remember the movie itself, and I wasn't quite sure what it was that captured me, but I was just absolutely riveted. I think it was a combination of just the fact that I knew that it was rooted in some history, that there was actually something that had happened that caused this movie. It wasn't totally fiction. And just, I think, as Gere, who basically stars as John Keel or John Keel's alter ego, as he goes through the movie, you watch him transform from a guy who's pretty concrete in his thinking to beginning to experience missing time, to experience phone calls, visions. His wife passes away. She has visions. And then at the end of it, of course, when the Silver Bridge goes down and they flash that this took place in 1967 and it's never truly been resolved. I'm getting chills even now talking about it because I remember the feeling of watching it the first time. And from that point forward, I always held on to that picture of that movie as being one that I felt somehow was changing me. And within a couple of years, my first wife and I were done, and I went out and bought the movie so I could watch it again. And I remember just being riveted to it even more so the second time. I can't even tell you how many times I've watched it now.
Yeah,
but
same
it
here.
inspired me to go out and to buy the Mothman Prophecies book. And although the two of them are significantly different, there are enough parallels between both the movie and the book to really fire up that creative imagination again. And I think that's what's really gotten me off on this 15 to 18-year quest now to keep learning more and more and more.
Andy, you've seen the Mothman Prophecies.
Of course, absolutely.
And what was your impression when you I don't think you knew a lot about John Keel when you first saw it, or am I wrong?
Not when I first saw it. I mean, I had an idea that it was based on a true story. The eeriness, I think, is the way I like to think of it. As we've talked before, I'm a big fan of something like I've got his name now, David Lynch and Twin Peaks. It had that kind of feel to it, but the very fact that it was a true story with that kind of feel to it, that really gripped me. I must admit, it was one of those ones I watch and then I think, I'll watch that again, just rewind it on video from Blockbusters, I suspect, as well, and just watch it again and think, oh, this is now I need to know more about this. And that's how I'm quite like Bill there. When I get into that, I really get into it, and I wanted to learn about all the story behind it and what was going on. Then when I read Keel's book, I realized obviously it was quite different to the movie, but it still had the general idea of those kind of strange experiences. So yeah, I say the eeriness is what got me, the kind of unreal kind of feeling of like, what the hell's going on here? And that really got to me too.
Well, I know that John Keel, I don't know if you ever heard this, Bill, but on I think it was 2002, was it February 2002 it came out, or maybe 2003? But John Keel was actually on Art Bell on Coast to Coast AM. And it was the first time in a long time he had done any kind of an interview. Of course, he was promoting the movie. And so Art Bell asked him what he thought about it, and he said he liked the film, and he reflects that too in the afterword to the more recent edition of the Mothman Prophecies that came out about the same time as the film. He talked about how Hollywood was able to sort of eke out, I think he said, some certain basic truths, underlying truths. But what he said was, kind of reflecting what Andy just said and what you said, Bill, is that it captured the feeling of of paranoia and eeriness that he felt in going through all this stuff, even though it isn't a carbon copy of the book. And also in this most recent Small Town Monsters DVD, The Mothman Legacy, they interview it. You see sound bites of Richard Hatem. He wrote the screenplay, and it's really interesting to hear him talk about it. It's worth getting the DVD just to hear him talk about the way the screenplay evolved. And one of the things he said people would come up to him afterwards and say, that movie scared the hell out of me, but I don't know why.
Yes. Yes.
Does that resonate?
Yeah, because I'll tell you, the movie, and as much as I'm raving about it right now, to me, it's not a great movie, but it's one that entranced me like nothing else ever has. And again, because I think it's the underlying message and the fact that it's rooted in historical fact, or perception anyhow, of John Keel and a lot of the folks that were experiencing these things in Point Pleasant, and the soundtrack is just off the charts. I absolutely love the soundtrack. In fact,
yes,
I have it scrolling as background white noise in my home office every single day. I listen to it all the time. So,
it's Tom. The name is Tom and Andy, all one word. And it's there's nothing in the way of it. Well, there's not much in the way of theme, but it's just the underlying score is just and then if you buy the CD, the 2 CD set, there are also several I don't know, I want to call them pop tunes, but they're King Black Acid and Low have done several songs. There's only 1 or 2 of them that make it into the film at all, but that also works very well. So that the soundtrack is phenomenal. And the other thing is that if you get a hold of the DVD, if you go to the extras, you'll see deleted scenes where they were actually trying to get more of the elements of the book in. That I won't go into it, but you'll see that if you've read the book and then have seen the film, there were going to be further attempts. They just didn't have time for, apparently, to try to get into the final film. My first reaction was a bit negative because I had followed John Keel for years, read the Mothman Prophecies, and I was a little disappointed that there wasn't more of and we can talk about this later, the Men in Black aspect. And of course, I think the reason they didn't pursue the Men in Black in the way that it was portrayed in the book was because not too many years before, you had at least 1 or 2 of these silly Men in Black farces, and if you start talking about Men in Black in the Mothman Prophecies film, people are going to start thinking they're going to see Tommy Lee Jones, doing a slip on a banana peel or something. So
that's a really good point.
But they kind of incorporated it in subtly with the Injured Cold character, which we need to talk about as well. And of course they take certain liberties. It's a film. It's not, when John Keel first got the script, he was kind of, his friend of his said he was kind of giddy. He said, they finally got some of the things right. I guess he'd seen one script after another they thought was horrible. And so he said, well, look, they've updated it. They've got the main character married, but still they hurt certain notes with it. What did you think about Alan Bates and the Dr. Leak character?
Oh, I just loved him. I thought he did a fantastic job. And I didn't know who Alan Bates was until after the movie and doing a little research and learning that he was a very highly acclaimed actor during his life. I thought he did a fantastic job.
Yeah, I love the back and forth between him and Richard Gere, where Richard Gere, the character, is at his wit's end, and he's Dr. Leak, Keel spelled backwards, played by Alan Bates, is telling him, what the terrible things he went through. And Gere says, well, didn't you need to know? And Alan Bates, the timing is perfect. The expression is perfect. And he says, we're not allowed to know.
We're not allowed to know. I love that line, Steve. I almost said it, but I didn't want to steal your thunder.
Oh no, you're supposed to steal thunder. You're the guest.
One of my favorite ones in their little dialogue, and I think it's the first one when they're downtown, what's supposed to be Chicago, and
right.
And Leak is pointing up to the skyscraper, and he's drawing the parallel between the window washer on the skyscraper and how he has a different perspective from where he's standing. And he could see a car crash that happened several blocks down the way where they couldn't because he had a different angle on things. And later on in their dialogue, and perhaps this is the second one now, but when Gere looks at Alan Bates and says, "Didn't you need to know?" And Steve, I know you know what his reply is.
Yes, and maybe we should let Andy say it this time. But it's a great moment in the film, and just so well played. Alan Bates was in I don't know if you guys came across this at all. Years ago, he was in I guess it was a French film. It was you had to have subtitles to get through it, but it was called King of Hearts. Did you guys ever see that one? It's you've got to get it. Geneviève Bujold is in it. It's I guess brief synopsis here. He plays a World War I soldier, and he goes into a town in France, and the Germans are coming in, and so the town vacates. So the only place left is the nuthatch, the mental house, and all the people there. So he goes in there and pretends he's nuts, and so that he can kind of filter in to the people that are mentally challenged, right? And then I'm calling them nuts, and I'm supposed to use mentally challenged, but all the people in the mental institution go into the town and they take over the occupations of everybody while everybody has vacated. Anyway, it's a bit of a farce, a bit of a comedy, but just a great classic Alan Bates film. Mm-hmm. Okay, so for those can run and find it and make sure you can read the subtitles. Yes, it's really fun talking about the film. And I watch it over and over now. It has, from my first initial reaction, which was a little bit negative, it's now has become one of my favorite films. And I, especially before going to the festival or whatever, I'll get it out, which really puts you in the mood. Mm-hmm. So what, when, now I know you've read the Mothman. You read was the Mothman Prophecies the first thing you read by John Keel?
It was the only thing that I was aware of that he had written, because going from the movie itself, obviously the book has the same title. So I ordered the book, and actually I want to say I downloaded the audio book. It's one of the first audiobooks of probably 100 that I have now, that I have on my phone, on my different devices and such. So I won't say that I have the book memorized, because that's beyond a stretch. That's not true. But I listen to it on a regular basis, and I've read through the book several times, cover to cover.
Well, that was my first downloaded audiobook as well, and it's really well done. And I don't know how many times I've listened to it. And you talk about knowing the book by heart. My buddy Brian, who composed the music for the High Strangeness Factor, he and I once in a while will send each other lines or quotes just out of a clear blue from the Mothman Prophecies, just to crack each other up, especially when Keel's talking to some of the old timers about their sightings and so forth, and the kind of lingo that they use. So that's always kind of fun.
Yeah.
But since then you've pursued, like many of us have, much more of John Keel's writings.
Well, I have gotten my hands, Steve, on almost everything that I could find by him, including the things that he published back in the 60s, 70s, and forward from there, and then the things that Andy Colvin put out as well too. I have all those compilations as well. So
yeah, Sorry, go ahead. No, I was just going to say those are the compilations are the articles that are scattered throughout magazines for over the decades, from Saga, Mail, True, Argosy, etc.
Yeah. And I have those not only in the hard copy, but I also have the audio versions of those too. One of the narrators that they used for those projects, a guy by the name of Michael Hacker, does a phenomenal job of narrating those books. I just love listening to his inflection as he's going through and reading the things that Keel had to say.
Yes, they're and some of those titles are some of them were sort of catchphrases that Keel used, like that great phonograph in the sky.
Yes,
because of course he was always talking about how people think they would have an experience and they would think, this is the first time this has happened. I'm hearing these voices from beyond or talking to these entities or whatever, but the same thing has happened over and over again, generation after generation, hundreds of years ago. So he said it was like that great phonograph in the sky playing over and over again.
Yes.
Let's see. Boy, there's just so many directions we can go here.
I was going to say, Steve, if you don't mind me just jumping in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Probably the least, I shouldn't say the least, but the last Keel book that I read was the first Keel book that he did, and that's Jadoo. And when I say that I read it, I don't have the hard copy of that. I have the audio version of that. It's one of the later ones that was put out by New Saucerian, but
right.
I love the narrator. Clay Lomakayu does a fantastic job with inflection and such too, and the right emotion. What a neat story that was about Keel's early years traveling in the Middle East and going over into India and into Tibet and such, and just I can't even imagine doing that now in my 50s. He did it in his 20s.
I know, and it's I don't know if you're familiar with it, Andy, but it was the first book he wrote. And I mean, there's times when he's out of money because his articles have been selling, but he hasn't got his money sent back to him to Egypt or wherever he was. This is after he talks about how Bill, remember when he was in the armed services?
Yeah.
And have you seen some of his lectures? There are several lectures that have been. Some of them are online, some of them are on YouTube. I got a hold of a couple of discs they're not very well done because they're just raw audio from some of the talks he gave in New York some years ago, I think in the 90s, 80s and 90s. But he was always engaging and always and he actually one of the things I think we should talk about is it's one of the things that you mentioned were remember the chapter called now is this was this in the Mothman Prophecies or Trojan Horse? By the way, all over. I apologize, but have you read Trojan Horse?
I have, Steve, and don't worry, I'm hanging right with you.
Okay.
I've got half of my Keel library up here in my home office and half of it down in the basement in the gym area. So I can't grab one to refer to right now. I have read Trojan Horse. I do have the narrated version audio book that came out maybe a year or two ago as well. Fascinating study. I'll tell you, I'm not, and I'm working on my doctorate in psychology, but I'm not a stats guy. So I've never been one that's like processed data quantitatively.
Right.
Keel did that without having any degree or any real training. He just learned how to do quantitative analyses and work with statistics in ways that I can't now, and I've had quite a bit of training. So he was just mind-boggling to me the way he was able to process information.
Well, he would read everything. I mean, he said, look, if you're going to study flying saucers, you got to know about things that fly in the sky, and aerodynamics and all that sort of thing. He was just voracious. He read all kinds of scientific journals. Well, Trojan Horse, and again, ladies and gentlemen, those who've heard me before, they hear me say some of the same things over and over again. But Trojan Horse came out long before Prophecies. And that's the one that just hit me between the eyes. I was an ET guy, little guys jumping out of flying saucers, collecting soil samples. And then I read kicking and screaming, really, because I had read Keel's Strange Creatures from Time and Space, which became The Guide to Mysterious Beings. And that's where he first talks about window areas. And so he's kind of softening you up a bit. But I was still an ET guy. And then I read Trojan Horse. And it took me a while to process it because that's where he brings, the everything together. As Rosemary Ellen Guiley wrote, he understood the interconnectedness of all paranormal phenomena. So so you appreciated the statistical aspect of it?
For two reasons. Number one, that's a game that I don't have, Steve.
Yeah, I don't either.
I'm not really a stats guy, and he just killed it. I mean, he did it before you had any kind of software to process it with. So he just sat there with magazines and newspaper clippings and writing and just studying this stuff voluminously just to stay on top of all of it. But I thought that was fantastic. But yeah, just neat, excellent book, way ahead of its time.
Well, I think that started with Playboy magazine hired him. They wanted him to write sort of a definitive article on UFOs. And so that's when he started getting into statistics. Now, I don't think that that article ever materialized, but he still had the research. And I'm going to tell another story that you don't know about, that but others will. A friend of mine, Kevin, we had our basic UFO club, and when we were in high school. Well, he went to the first the 1967 Congress of Scientific Ufologists in New York City at the Commodore Hotel, run by James Mosley, the editor of Saucer News.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so he met Gray Barker. I met Gray Barker for a few minutes one time. He met Gray Barker and James Mosley and John Keel and Timothy Beckley and all these people back when he was in junior high. Well, the next year, I think it was, he and a buddy of his that he met there, a guy named Mark, they got John Keel's address. And he said, as he told me, he said, we actually had the balls to go knock cold on his door at the apartment. And he let him in. He was very gracious. And they sat around for about an hour and a half, just talking about whatever. John Keel was in his pajamas, and they were all sitting, like I say, sitting cross-legged on the floor. He was surrounded by newspaper clippings. And this was going to be either he was working on the Playboy article or what was to become Trojan Horse. And they were right there when that little piece of history was taking place.
Yeah, that's awesome. That is awesome.
I wish I had met him.
There is a gentleman that I got connected with over Facebook recently, a researcher out of Australia by the name of Paul Dean. Does that name sound familiar to you?
It does sound familiar, yes.
So I'd never met him before, but I had the opportunity to do a different show, and he had heard me, and he sent me a message on Facebook Messenger and said, I've got a bunch of John Keel stuff. Do you want to see it? And of course I wanted to see it. So he sent me some pictures of John Keel's apartment and what it looked like. And Steve, it's exactly like you were just describing it. I mean, strewn throughout the entire area, article upon article. I mean, I'm kind of an OCD guy. That would have driven me crazy, but he knew how to work in that kind of an environment.
Yeah, he was just I know a lot of people that knew him at different time periods. And of course he was at the 2003 Mothman Festival, where they unveiled the great Mothman statue that we just saw a little while ago. So, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the key points in sort of the Mothman saga, whether it be Cornstalk or John Keel's relationship with Mary Hyre, the TNT area? I mean, there's just so much. We can talk about it in terms of, again, your journey, your evolution. What were your stepping stones in going through all this kind of a maze?
Sure, and it's quite the maze. It really is. And I remember going through the book for the first time, and a lot of the things that were covered in the book that weren't covered in the movie, of course, I think it's just natural to take a look at, well, that wasn't in the movie. This is interesting, and file that away mentally and think about it later. But one of the first thing that pops up into my head about the book itself was some of the depictions, without using the term Men in Black, but some of the strange people or creatures that seemed to be afoot in the Point Pleasant area during 66 and 67. And I'm thinking particularly about a woman who said that, and I'm thinking she had some police involvement. She'd called the cops a few times because there were disturbances around her house. They'd show up. They thought she was crazy. But then she spoke later on, I believe, with Keel directly and talked about how these really tall people would kind of come to the door, and then they'd take off, and they'd be getting into, I think her cattle were mutilated, if I remember correctly, and she.
This was the lady I think he called Mrs. Bryant, and this was over across the river in Gallipolis.
Okay, but she mentioned how these individuals were taking parts of the cows that didn't make any sense. I mean,
right.
Things that you wouldn't want, not choice cuts or anything like that. And then she talked about how when you'd shine, a flashlight or what have you out the window, she'd see them. They'd be all dressed in white, and they could jump over a fence that was like 6 or 7 feet tall, And it just sounded absolutely ridiculous, but it was written down, and this was her testimony, and there was so much strange stuff happening then that was one of the things that I filed away immediately and thought, wow, that's not in the movie, but it's an interesting point in the book.
Well, the things that she talked about were classic cattle mutilations that they were, I guess, really discovering out in mass out west for a while in the 70s. And she's one of the few. That's one of the few cases where anybody said that they saw who the culprits were. But you're right. She was experiencing classic haunting phenomena. And not only that, she was leaving work one night and she had a sort of an Indrid Cold type experience without these gentlemen identifying themselves as Indrid Cold. And if anybody's seen the movie or knows that Indrid Cold was supposed to have been a visitor from elsewhere that contacted a man named Woodrow Derenberger, loosely portrayed by what's his name in the film?
Patton.
What's that? Yeah, Will Patton. I can't think of the name of the character, but that's a whole nother interesting aspect. Let me ask you this. There are some aspects of this that seem very physical. I mean, footprints and so forth. There are other aspects that seem to be more elusive. Even the Mothman entity itself was what? An apparition? Something physical? You get into the Indrid Cold history or mythos, depending on how you look at it. Some of Derenberger's initial experiences seem real, but some later seem like they were, he got a little bit fanciful and made them up. How do you, from coming from your perspective and your the PhD you're working on, how do you sort through this stuff? I mean, it's just it is a maze and it is confusing, but how do you process some of this stuff?
I think it's incredibly challenging to do that. Let me back up for a second, if I could, Steve. The character played by Will Patton went by the name Gordon Smallwood.
Gordon Smallwood, right.
Now, Gordon Smallwood, I later learned, was the name, like a fictitious name that was given in, I want to say it was They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers.
Yes, that's right.
So I know when I first heard that, it was one of those ahas, like chill type things, because I'm familiar with the name from the movie, and then 10 years later, I'm learning that this is actually a name that Richard Haddam must have gone back and just kind of plucked from Gray Barker's book and tossed into the movie, which is just what a classy move. I thought that was really cool that he did that. The aspects of the actual phenomena, the things that happened in Point Pleasant and Parkersburg, which is the kind of the backdrop to the whole Woody Derenberger / Indrid Cold beginnings in any event. Really, really strange stuff. You've got this alleged spaceman who is flying in a tea kettle, basically.
Yes.
He basically buzzes Woody Derenberger. He pulls down in front of him and then gets out with his arms crossed and just looks at him and communicates telepathically and tells him, hey, I'm from a world that's far less powerful than yours, and I wish you no harm. I cut and bleed just as you do. I mean, he was your traditional spaceman with a good vision for humanity, and we're just here to hang out. He introduced himself as a searcher, and he asked Woody what Woody did, and Woody, of course, was a salesman at that point in his career. But what an interesting interaction. I have seen and actually heard some clips of John Keel later on talking about the whole Woody Derenberger aspect of things, and he did think there was some truth and some validity to the first report that Woody had about Indrid Cold, but then he kind of felt that he went off the deep end and maybe started making things up as things progressed. I don't know what I believe about that. It makes a wonderful story. It's, to me, a fantastic aspect of high strangeness, no question about that. And in the Mothman Prophecies, with the Mothman itself, you mentioned before about it perhaps being a phantom or being some type of an apparition or a shadow or what have you. That thing just seemed to manifest to people in Point Pleasant and in the surrounding areas as something a little bit different. A lot of folks talked about it being this 6 to 7 foot black or dark gray shrouded type of thing with these piercing red eyes. But then there are other people like Thomas Urey who describe it as being a big bird. And I've heard it referred to by Point Pleasant and West Virginia locals as the big bird, and they didn't really know it as Mothman. That was more of a television station that picked up that name and kind of ascribed that to what the phenomena was. Right. So, I mean, really, really weird stuff. It did seem almost that the folks, as they perceived it, it kind of coupled with their own understanding and their maybe predispositions psychologically, religiously, what have you. They framed it in the context that they were familiar with. And Keel himself talks in the Mothman Prophecies about how folks in West Virginia perceived this thing and perceived him when they thought that he was a man in black in the very beginning of the book as the devil himself. So they framed it in a religious context. So, I mean, really, really interesting the way the whole community had a little bit different take on what was happening.
And that event really happened. What Bill is alluding to is in the opening chapter of the book, which is just phenomenal. He talks about this stranger that's wandering the roads at night, who's really out of place because he's got a beard. He's wearing this black suit, and he claims that his car has broken down, and so he's knocking on these doors. And one of the people that he knocked on the doors to apparently perished on the Silver Bridge not too long after that. And Keel was asked about that in an interview, I think, in The Great Phonograph in the Sky, and I'm not sure who did the interview, but it's one of the old published ones. And he said yes, because he came across this later on when he was in West Virginia. People talked about it, and I don't know who it was. This couple died on the bridge, and they had been visited by this mysterious visitor. And of course, Keel reveals that it's just a tired John Keel catching a whale of a cold.
Yep.
And trying to find a record to tow his car out of the mud. So it's really interesting to delve, to get more into it. The Mothman Prophecies book, half of it was hacked out, and some of it was salvaged in the Eighth Tower. But imagine having the original manuscript, the original notes that he pulled it from. Imagine having Mary Hyre, the reporter that he worked with, having her correspondence and so forth. All that's gone, or so much of it's gone.
Yes, and it's fascinating stuff, Steve. And one of the things we haven't gone into yet so far, and I found this really mysterious in the Mothman Prophecies itself, and then in later things I was able to pick up down the road, was this whole Apol, Agar,
yes,
Jay Sparrow connection. And it seems that that's where the prophecies mostly were coming from, was from that whole Mount Misery and Long Island aspect of the book, which is kind of expounded on in some of Keel's journals and things. That is fascinating. I'd like to hear your takes on that.
And of course, when you talk about the Indrid Cold character in the film, that's derived from the alleged Indrid Cold character from the book, and also this Mr. Apple, spelled like Apol,
yes,
and some of these other entities. And well, it's interesting because two of the books you mentioned in your talking points, the big breakthrough and the big blackout, which are taken from Doug Skinner, has the johnkeel.com. And those books are taken from a lot of the letters and so forth that John Keel wrote. And you can see these are like some of the original manuscript of the Mothman Prophecies. And so you really get into John Keel's head. He's wondering, a lot of the information is coming from Jay Perrow, and Jay Perrow's mentioned in the book, but also there's another lady mentioned called Jane. Well, it turns out Jane is Jay Perrow. It was just a literary device, so which I did not know at the time. But Keel is constantly questioning himself because a lot of the information is coming through Jay Perrow, and he's wondering, well, is she putting me on? I've got to be really careful about this. This is pretty wild stuff. But then he'd say, some of these things she's coming up with, there's no way she could know about them. This is stuff that I haven't published anywhere or talked to anybody about. So, I wonder too if, any researcher can get taken. I mean, he got taken for a while with Tom Montalone.
Yes.
Tom Montalone kind of paralleled the Indrid Cold stuff without getting too deep into it. But later on, he figured out that Tom was full of it, But some of it made, unfortunately made it into the Mothman Prophecies anyway. So I'm constantly stuck, Bill. I mean, somebody can make a cogent argument at one point and I can buy it, or I can make my own internal argument at one point and think, oh, that sounds good. But then you get pulled over to the other side or a different view. And I guess so much of it I hold in suspension, because I just don't know. And John Keel would have told everybody, he said, I didn't know. I don't know what the Mothman was. He was very much against the ET concept, but still left the door open as a possibility. So I just find it endlessly fascinating, and I thank God that so much of this stuff that has been lost for decades is out there.
It's so much fun, Steve. I just love reading it, coming at it from a different angle, having conversations with other people who are as into it as I am, like you are. It's so much fun because, again, these aren't conversations I can have with folks that I run into up and down the street in business. You can go to a certain level, but as Amanda and Jackie and I were sharing on our trip to Point Pleasant last week, you can have a conversation with somebody who expresses a mild interest in the Mothman phenomenon. But you can also, if you pay attention, if you get going into this like we are right now, you can see the eyes glaze over. You can metaphorically take a step back, sometimes literally take a step back, because you've crossed over into you're weird, dude, back off. We don't need to talk about this anymore territory pretty quick.
Well, we all may end up, in our own individual padded rooms, or we could end up on the streets of Point Pleasant playing checkers or chess, just kind of talking about the good old days and Indrid Cold and everything. But back when I had this idea at one time that this wasn't ET at all, that these were, how did I put it, psychic projections of a collective human subconscious, and they were made manifest sometimes like poltergeist phenomena was. And I would get in conversations with people that weren't ready for this, that had and I would actually say some of these words, and I think they kind of tried to see if there were any padded rooms available back in those days that they could have sent me to. But I kind of learned, but I had been fortunate to have certain friends that aren't really into this, that you can talk with this somewhat, and they kind of get, if you're involved in this a bit, like we've all been on radio shows and so forth, they kind of enjoy your little bit of success, so they kind of, it's kind of fun from that aspect. Yeah. But there's certain places that you really don't want to, you don't want to talk deeply about it.
That's very true. And Steve, I've worked in sales for close to 30 years and in technology sales specifically for the last 22. And I can have these conversations with coworkers and they think it's neat, but I know they think I'm off the deep end a little bit too. And as I've gotten close to completing the doctorate in psychology, I've been really kind of hesitant to go full bore into the paranormal with the credentialing. And there's that part of me that's a little bit concerned just about making that rift from traditional psychological practice and research and going into this full time. And almost thinking about using a pseudonym here and there just because of the connotations of it. I don't want to get blackballed before I even begin my career,
I've really got to come in here.
Yes.
Bill, Steve's told you I'm a professional psychotherapist, so yes. I absolutely feel everything you're saying there. I do my best to keep the identities apart. I mean, I have my therapist self, my occult writer self, and my esoteric paranormal self. So I can relate to what you're saying there, certainly. It's a funny thing, in 15 years of working professionally, I've had two people who have said, hey, do you do stuff about witchcraft? And one person, do you do something about ghosts? It's happened. Fortunately, both people have been clients who've been interested in those phenomena anyway, so it's been okay. But that's always been a concern of mine. You don't want those two worlds to bleed into each other too much in case it starts to cause you problems ethically, or that they might think you're a bit of a kook. That's obviously, you don't want them to think that. So I entirely understand what you're saying there. It is one of those kind of dilemmas. I write under one name that's similar to my own name, but I also work professionally under my sort of birth name, if you like. So I can relate to what you're saying there, certainly.
Well, it's good to hear that, Andy, and I appreciate your input because I'm not exactly sure where I'm going with this, but the deeper I get, to stay away from the analogy of saying me and John Klein or John Keel or whoever it is, the deeper I get into the whole Mothman phenomenon and Keel's studies and things of that nature, the more and more attracted I am to it. And I'm not saying that I'm going to be the one to solve it because I don't think anybody's ever going to solve it, whatever it is. But I think there are some aspects of the paranormal that can be approached from a psychological perspective. And that's exactly what I would like to do in terms of my own aspirations to do writing. And to kind of piggyback on what you were saying, I'm going to turn my dissertation into a book with the help of somebody who can help me de-scientificize it, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely.
And here's the thing about me is that I've learned how to be a technical writer now through my education. So my dissertation is going to be written in that fashion, but it's only really for one specific audience, and that's for academia. But to turn it into a work that's more publishable for the masses, so to speak, it's about post-traumatic growth and divorce. It's the good stuff you can experience from going through a bad experience.
Yes.
So to be able to do that, I want to publish that in one way, and maybe I use my name for that and do my paranormal publishing in somebody else's. Maybe I'll be Steve Ward Jr. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I don't know. My advantage is people have always known I was a little bit strange from the time I was in grade school. So nobody bats an eye when I talk about this stuff. And I want to let everybody know that you are listening to the High Strangeness Factor, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. And I am Steve Ward, and Andy Mercer and I, are talking to Bill Kousoulas and about all things, obviously, John Keel, paranormal, and Mothman. Bill, let's get a little more into, as you're talking about what you're working on toward your PhD and what you hope to accomplish with it, at least partially, with the aspects of the paranormal, and what we've all, I think all of us, even though I'm more of an armchair guy, I've talked to several people that have had missing time and abduction experiences. It can be pretty traumatic, and a lot of other aspects of the, even the stranger at the bed, the shadow people, the whatever, can be pretty traumatic. So. Tell us about what you hope to work toward, or what you hope to accomplish.
And thanks for that question, Steve. I'm one of those guys who's kind of seen myself as a terminal student. I'll tell you, I graduated college with my bachelor's in English at the age of 29 back in 1996, and then I got into sales, and I enjoyed it and have been successful with it. It's been a good vehicle, basically, to help me pursue my other interests. It's not necessarily a means in and of itself, but it's helped me to foster other interests like the paranormal things we're talking about now. So when I went back to school at the age of 43, I asked my wife, I said, Jackie, do you think I could take a class? And she's like, yeah, go ahead. It'll get you off my back for a while. So I did that, and I enjoyed it. It was Psychology 304. It was personality theory. And so from that point forward, I took another class and another, and I decided I didn't need a second bachelor's degree. That would be stupid. I already had one of those. So I decided to get into graduate school, and I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just wanted to have a master's. By the time I finished the master's, I was really enjoying the writing aspect of things. And having a bachelor's in English and a passion for fantasy, science fiction, horror, all these things in my past, I'd always wanted to be a published author. So getting into the doctoral level, it was just one of those things. I enjoyed doing the writing and getting into a higher level of writing. I figured if I can knock this out, if this is doable for me, in my 40s and 50s, then I can pretty much do anything. So I decided to set my nose to the grindstone while I was still working in sales and did the both of those. But I never really knew where I was going to go with the both of them. And as the roads begin to kind of pull apart from each other, the business world and my psychological and parapsychological interests, what's become more and more apparent to me is that although I kind of have a heart for therapy and I like helping people, I don't see myself necessarily as a helping practitioner. So the next best thing for a guy who loves literature like I do and loves to write like I do is to work on becoming a published author. So setting the post-traumatic growth and divorce book up, that's going to be an easy transition from dissertation to publishing. So that part, I expect to get that done within the first quarter of next year. That's the goal for that. What's intimately interesting to me is, with the passion that I have for the paranormal, and specifically Keel and similar authors' writings, I just really believe that there is a need out there to help validate people who have experienced paranormal experiences, not necessarily as a therapist, but as somebody who can kind of chronicle their experiences, put them together in a format under the same guise of the post-traumatic growth paradigm. Now, I don't know. I imagine, Andy, you have some familiarity with post-traumatic growth?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it's a cornerstone really of how I work with my clients. You know, most of them have had some kind of experience. I always brought them to me as a therapist, but helping them understand those experiences and see if there is something that can be learnt from those. You know, pointing out every experience has a positive element if it doesn't kill you. Effectively, I mean, it's a kind of quote from Nietzsche, but it's quite true. If it doesn't kill you, it can only make you stronger, provided you understand what you've experienced and what it's about. I've had a few clients who've come to me with what you would certainly describe as paranormal experiences over the years, without a doubt. One of them, a really quite fascinating case. I often mention this, and the guy does. Now I talk about it because he was amazed as well. Just to give you a little sideline of some things that can happen. I had a client who, like most, would get quite emotional when they were talking about something that was uncomfortable, particularly if we were recalling memories of childhood experiences, which is how I tend to work. And with him, every time he got emotional, the ceiling cracked. Not just once or twice, but every time. And he came for quite a few months and a lot of emotional experiences, but every time there was a substantial crack in the ceiling of my office, just as if some beam was being hit. It was quite remarkable. I mean, I know it's something that Carl Jung himself experienced with his work. He had a particular client that often hours later there would be a strange crack. And on one occasion, he was having dinner with Sigmund Freud, and they were sitting at the dinner table, and the table cracked. And Jung said, "Give it a minute or two, there'll be another one." And lo and behold, there was. And Freud was, "Oh, this is rather strange." But certainly those kind of things definitely happen. There's an emotional explosion of energy that comes out with some people. But as I say, that scene crack was quite a phenomenon. So, yeah, it is. Sorry, I'm kind of cut off your question, really. But yes, no, absolutely, I understand totally about growth through trauma, through the understanding of our experiences, certainly.
Well, I appreciate that input, Andy. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't think you jumped off topic at all. That's exactly the type of thing that I'd like to be able to talk to people about. And I've got a basic set of questions that I was able to use for my dissertation. They're framed in the context of the divorces that the gentleman who I interviewed experienced. But it's very easy. Jackie and I have already made the transition into the line of questions that we would have. And these are open-ended questions. We would expect any interviews that we're going to conduct to be basically along the terms of the experiencer's experience. I just love to hear what people have to say and then be able to put that into an analysis that's similar to what I was able to do for the dissertation, but to do it in the context of the paranormal. There's just so much stuff that's beyond today's understanding, and hearing that somebody who you've had conversations with who's externalized extreme emotions to the degree that they can cause physical damage beyond their own control, or at least it seems that way. That's perfect material, I think, for the type of thing that I'd like to write about.
Absolutely. I have a question for both of you, actually. Imagine I know nothing about Mothman or Point Pleasant or anything. If you had to explain it within a couple of minutes, just very briefly, what would you say? How would you put it across to somebody?
Go ahead, Bill, and then I'll copy.
Sure. It's a tough one to answer, so I'm sure Steve's going to help me fill in the blanks here. There's just so much material, and I always try to go back to what I believe is the epicenter of the phenomenon, which was 66 and 67 in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And what we had there was a convergence of phenomena that ranged from lights in the skies to our friend Carolyn Harris told Jackie and me on our first visit to Point Pleasant in 2016 that her brother experienced a UFO that landed in his backyard. So we had these purple lights that were in the sky. We had UFOs. We had mysterious beings. We had men in black. We had, of course, the Mothman, which is what it's centered around. But all the elements of high strangeness that took place, culminating in again, like you had just mentioned, Andy, culminating in a physical manifestation of perhaps a collective psyche or unconscious that ended up resulting in the Silver Bridge going down. Now, I guess as I hear myself say that, I don't want to imply that I think that the people of Point Pleasant or even this Mothman phenomenon caused the bridge to go down, but it just seems that there were so many premonitions that people received. Mary Hyre saw gifts floating in the river in a dream that she experienced. So much strangeness happened in a 13-month period of time within this small community that it's worth examining, really, for anybody who's even skeptical about the paranormal. There's enough material there, I think, to sway the opinions of a pretty hardline skeptic.
And let's explain for those that may not know. Carolyn Harris, of course, was the we lost her a couple of years ago. She was the ran the Harris's Steakhouse, otherwise known as the Mothman Diner. She co-created the Mothman Festival with Jeff Walmsley, and she was just such a great lady. She actually lost her little boy and her ex-husband on the bridge that night when it was crossing. He was only, I think, about 6 years old. And so in spite of that tragedy, she saw this the festival and all these things as something good for an area that had become as depressed as Point Pleasant was. And also, there was this focal point where all this stuff happened, but it also was happening in other parts of the Ohio Valley, and even, maybe it was following John Keel, because in upstate New York, you mentioned Mount Misery, Bill, in your talking points, was I guess a hill or whatever somewhere in upstate New York, where a lot of this, I guess some of it was a bit rural, but also it wasn't very far from rather congested places. With the same thing, they were seeing cryptids and lights in the sky. So a lot of this stuff was going on all over the place. And let me, while my stream of consciousness is flowing, the purple lights that Keel talked about. He was in the Chief Cornstalk Hunting Grounds, which is south of Point Pleasant, going down towards Gallipolis Ferry. And he saw these strange purple lights. And in one of the lectures that he gave, this is not in the book, he talks about how they almost seemed like they were alive, but they came down and they surrounded him. They circled him for a while and then took off again, almost like they were something intelligent. So there was this smorgasbord of the paranormal going on. Yeah, but you have to kind of when you're explaining it to people, you have to talk about what people saw. They saw, they all saw this creature or apparition. It was very similar, the way it looked, and all, you had the lights going over. I guess you're going to tell them about the aspect of the window area. You need to kind of explain that, where John Keel seemed to see all these things congregate in one area. Another thing, what you mentioned earlier, Bill, when the Tom Urey saw something more like a thunderbird than the Mothman himself or itself. I actually got to talk to Tom Urey at one of the Mothman festivals, and he told me that he went with Marcella Bennett, who was one of the original witnesses. She's the one that was carrying her child when this thing rose up off the ground. They also were seeing some kind of a strange light in the sky at the same time. So he believed that initially that people like Linda Scarberry and Marcella Bennett and some of the others saw the same thing he did, but they were freaked out by it. So they added the details, the sort of mysticism to it. But after talking to Marcella Bennett, he decided that no, in fact, they had seen different things. And Bill, and Andy, do you seem to see that in areas like this that there are, while people will see much of the same thing, there are anomalies within the anomalies. People would see stuff that doesn't make any sense within the strangeness.
Oh, absolutely.
You know what I mean? Okay.
Absolutely. One area that I've been doing a little research on and haven't got back to for must be a couple of years now for various reasons, but in brief, you've all sure both heard of the Rendlesham Forest incident over here in the 1980s, I suppose, UFO landing near Rendlesham Base. That one happened in the 80s, but Rendlesham Forest itself has had a history of strange phenomena and occurrences long before the supposed UFO landing. And I met a guy, basically, I was on a field trip to the place, and he was also doing a bit of research, just looking around. But he told me some of the stories of what the locals had seen. I mean, very strange creatures, including more than one sighting of something that seemed literally two-dimensional, as in flat, literally side on, it was there, it turned and disappeared, as if it was literally just flat and two-dimensional.
And this is in the Rendlesham area?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in the forest itself, absolutely. I know of, I think I mentioned to you before, a farmer back in the 1960s dug up a skull. Now, there are tumuli, ancient burial sites, around the area, but a farm nearby dug up a human skull, that was elongated. It didn't look very human at all. It was human-like, but it was elongated. Handed it over to local police, never heard a word again about it. That was just gone. But it was, the person I spoke to was a relative of the farmer who owned the land, who actually dug it up. It was pulled up by the plough. So there have been strange phenomena of various kinds going on in that area for long before the UFO landing. So it kind of ties in what you were saying before. I know we've talked about this before, the whole idea of the areas of high strangeness, those specific points around the world where strange phenomena occurs and seem to be concentrated in those certain areas. But yeah, absolutely, there's very much a history prior to the UFO landing in Rendlesham, certainly.
Andy, that's interesting that you mentioned Rendlesham specifically, because even though we're on different sides of the pond here, about a year and a half ago, Jackie and I got introduced to our first MUFON, or Mutual UFO Network meeting, about 35 miles from where we live, and really in the middle of my sales territory. It was a couple's goal we had. Let's check out a MUFON meeting. So at our very first MUFON meeting, none other than Jim Peniston is there.
Oh.
Now, Jim Peniston, Steve, I'm not sure. Are you aware of Jim? Do you know Jim's name?
I know the name, but I don't know nearly as much about Rendlesham as you guys do. So go ahead.
And I don't know as much, I'm sure, as Andy does. But what I can share with you is Jim Peniston was present that day. And this is before his most recent book came out, The Rendlesham Enigma, which he co-authored with a gentleman by the name of Gary Osborne. Mm-hmm. Now, Jim has kind of become a friend of ours. I mean, we've been to dinner with him a couple of times, and he's shared at different presentations and in private conversations some of the things he's experienced. And his most recent book is the most documented, well-documented book I've ever read. It's written really, really well by the both of them, and Gary really incorporates towards the end of it, without spoiling the book for you, some fascinating stuff that the two of them have kind of uncovered in regards to the experiences that Jim had when he was in Rendlesham Forest in 1980.
It's fascinating. Yeah, I mean the various versions of the story that have been told about what's supposed to happen over those few nights, it's just beggars belief. But it is a very interesting area, certainly.
Yeah, I would love to know more about the other high strangeness aspects in the area, which I've been completely ignorant of. But yeah, there's just so many. I have told the not really a joke anymore that I've got 200 books on my short list, and my short list keeps growing, and I know all those other volumes that are just screaming to be read and opened are just waiting there. So but anyway, I guess our time is starting to grow a little short here, but Bill, you'll have to be a regular guest. We're going to have to do this again, and maybe if you even want to have the ladies come on with you sometime, that would be a blast, because we had such a good time talking in Point Pleasant last weekend. I just wanted to ask you, are you some of the other authors that you might have explored? What about Jacques Vallee?
Now, we have Vallee's Passport to Magonia here,
right?
And
okay.
I've had it probably for 6 to 9 months, and I just couldn't get into it. Now, that doesn't mean that if I took a deep breath and looked at it again and jumped into it that I could get into it, because I probably could. But right now, Jackie's reading that one. My reading has been it's been focused in paranormal and in psychology due to my education. So I guess the ones that I have going right now would be, let's see, and I typically have 4 or 5 books going at the same time.
Yeah.
So right now I'm reading a couple of psychological books. One of them is foundational in post-traumatic growth theory. It's by a couple of authors by the name of Tedeschi and Calhoun. And so that's one of the primary ones I'm reading right now. I'm reading one of Abraham Maslow's more recent interpretations by Scott Berry. I think that's his name. Does that sound right, Andy?
Yes, yes.
That's
You,
that.
you, you know, I might wait on those two, but go ahead.
But I think they dovetail nicely with some of the things we're talking about
Oh,
here.
they probably do.
Keel specifically covers so much ground in bringing psychology into ufology and high strangeness and all that. But in terms of the things I'm reading presently right now, I do have Andy Colvin's Mothman Speaks. I'm working on that one for a second time now. I read it 4 or 5 years ago also. And then I'm also going through, I have the big blackout that's just sitting in my stack downstairs from a parapsychological standpoint. If I was downstairs, I could tell you, Steve. I'm sorry, they're not.
Oh, that's fine.
But Gray Barker definitely is one that I've read. He's another one that I've covered, and then Brent Rains, of course, too.
Oh, okay. Vallee also wrote years later, after Magoni had been out of print for a while, he wrote kind of a trilogy, Dimensions, Revelations, and I think Confrontations. Not necessarily in that order, and he revisits a lot of the Magonia stuff in there. You may want to approach, from that aspect. He's also written Messengers of Deception. He's got some just fascinating books there. I also recommend Jenny Randall's. Jenny Randall's has approached a lot of this stuff in sort of a Keel-esque fashion, if you will. Mind Monsters. She's just got she's such a great thinker and researcher, and I think I mentioned Colin Wilson to you guys when we were down there last weekend.
Yes.
He has talked about he corresponded with Keel to a great extent, and that's talked about in Alien Dawn. And then he wrote this great chapter in Mysteries, which pulls in Keel and Lethbridge, the Dowser, and F.W. Holliday, the Loch Ness guy. It's just fascinating. So I think we all have a few books to catch up with.
Always.
Yes.
So anyway, I think we should kind of. What time is it for you there, Andy? Right now?
For me, it's 1:30, but that's absolutely fine. It's early for me still.
But you're just getting wound up at 1:30,
I am
right?
very much the night owl, Bill. Being self-employed as a therapist means I can set my own timetable. I work afternoons and evenings, so I have a nice long night and get to lay in the morning. So it's all rather nice. That's another reason to work for yourself, by the way. I work privately as a professional therapist. You can dictate your own hours, which is very nice.
Yes.
Well, it's funny how that works for us retired guys too.
Yes.
I envy you there, Steve. No question. Hey, before I let you go, and I don't know how much time you got left.
Whatever you want.
We just love the Mark Randall collaboration, and your piece in the Small Town Monsters video is excellent. You did a very nice job.
Oh, you watched it? Okay.
Oh yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Well, that's good. I thought the lighting was very good.
It was a very well put together thing, and
It was.
We had gone specifically to introduce ourselves to Seth, but we figured we could do that a different time. It was great to meet you, and thanks for Shanghaiing us. We really enjoyed it.
Oh, I didn't want to let you guys go. I thought, well, you're down a week. You could spend another day or two. I mean, what would that be? What harm would that be?
We just did that.
So anyway, Bill, I just want to thank you for being on the show, and I want this to be our send-off show. And I would like you to come back periodically because anybody that delves into this aspect, whether it be focused on Keel, Point Pleasant, and Mothman, or the paranormal in general, there's just so many ways you can go. And since the three of us are not really focused on, we're not vested in one area. Say a flesh and blood cryptid or a nuts and bolts craft from Alpha Centauri. We try to, the three of us try to, like Keel, really try to pull in all these different aspects and be aware of parallels and patterns that seem to bring these things together. That's why I think you may. Once you get into Vallee, and there's others that have approached the folklore aspect. There's The Thieves in the Night by Joshua Kucin is another great book covering that aspect. And I've got a maybe 20 books on folklore, on the fairies and so forth, that is just phenomenal. The stuff you pull out of there. that was written hundreds of years ago, or talks about the beliefs of 100 years ago that parallel what's going on now and what has been going on for the last several decades. So, Bill, I just really want to thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Steve. Andy, nice to meet you.
You too, absolutely, yeah. Hope
Yes,
you get back on again soon.
And I wasn't uncomfortable at all being surrounded by two shrinks.
You shouldn't
We'll
really
bill you later.
Although I'd probably make a good test case, if you need to practice. But and do you want to give any contact information to anybody that would like to get a hold of you?
Sure, absolutely. The best way to contact me at this particular time is just through my Facebook account. It's Bill Kousoulas. Kuciles is spelled Koussoulas. There is a website that's under development. It's not quite ready yet, but hopefully the next time the three of us can reconvene, that'll be off the ground too.
That'll be excellent. And Andy, I'm glad you were able to join us tonight, because this is you were definitely able to use your expertise and talk about some things that that you know all about and I know nothing about. So. And also, people can find, if they Google your name, you've been on a lot of shows. Recently, you've been on the Paracast, which is a pretty big podcast on the paranormal, I think. And you've been on quite a few shows that people can probably find if they Google your name on Google. I guess that's the way to do it.
Well, thanks for that information, Steve. This one's been a lot of fun. This has been a blast.
Okay, well, I'm glad you had a good time, because it's just shooting from the hip radio, and you can tell we don't have much of a schedule here, and we just kind of it's just me, it's just me babbling, and thank God Andy is here sometimes to keep me on the straight and narrow. So let me do my closeout. Sit tight, everybody, and we'll talk a little bit after the show. And again, I want to thank Bill for being here. It was just, I really, really enjoyed this, as I enjoy all my shows, but some of them are particularly fun. And I want to say that the High Strangeness Factor was created by Steve Ward and Andy Mercer and is copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I want to thank our fearless leaders here at the network, Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson. I also want to thank Andy Mercer in his capacity as producer for the show, and Brian Zeller for the theme music for the show. I can also be heard as a correspondent on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files every week on this same network and other networks as well. And I am Steve Ward, your humble host here on the High Strangeness Factor, a displaced Yank here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Thank you for listening. I will see you all again in a fortnight. Take care. And I guess that's it. We're done.
Hey, thanks, Steve.
I will stop.